Good evening, everyone. And if I may say, bonsoir, thank you for joining us. And Bezrat Hashem, tonight we will be speaking about the Jews of France and the history of Jews in France. It's an important subject to cover, not only because of the history of Jews in France, but because the history of emancipation and modernity very much started in France, and a lot of the conversations that were had about the life of Jews in modern society, the life of Jews in a integrated secular country, really started in France for good and for bad. I'll give an example. A few weeks ago, there was an Israeli professor who was a French-speaking professor who's, I don't know if he's a biologist, a doctor, and he was asked to come speak on the French television about the pandemic, health-related issues. And the reason, it should have been a not very noticed interview on television, but it became a sensation because when he was on the French television, the producer, whoever's interviewing him, asks him, "I see that you're wearing a kippah on your head. Do you think it's appropriate to wear a religious symbol in public?" Because it goes against the French belief in a public sphere that's neutral of any religious symbols. And so it was a whole exchange back and forth. But a lot of the questions of how being Jewish in a secular society should work in the modern era really emanated in France, and the emancipation actually even predates Napoleon, as we're going to see. But let's quickly take a look at the ancient French Jewish history. Interestingly, there's a very interesting account of the first Jew in France. Who's the first Jew in France? So after King Herod, the one who built the Second Temple, reigned, there was a whole dispute who is going to succeed him. And his son wanted to succeed him. And his son's name is Herod Archelaus. And basically, he goes and he wants to be his father's successor. He wants to be king in Jerusalem, but the people of Jerusalem don't like him. He's too pro-Roman, so they send a delegation to Rome to speak out against him. And one thing leads to the other. He ends up being expelled by Rome. Rome want what's good for business, so they expel the son of Herod to Gaul, to an area in France. And there's actually archaeological evidence of all these different Roman camps in France. So actually there are two Hasmonean kings that are sent into exile into France. And one is Herod Archelaus, and it says that he dies in Gaul in the year 16 BCE. So you have a Jew who's dying there in 16 BCE. And you also have another king named Herod Antipas, and he's also sent to exile to France. So you can imagine that if there were these two being sent already in the BCEs, that there's no question that there were other Jews that were being also because France was part of the Roman Empire, there were other Jews in France. Obviously, after the destruction of the Second Temple and after the quashing of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, Jews scattered all across the Roman Empire, and France, or Gaul, was no exception. And so there's these Jewish communities being built up, especially in southern France, where it's close to the Mediterranean, it's close to Italy, there's the Rhone River, and that's where you have the first Jewish communities being established. In the year 425, you have an official document that we have that speaks of the Jews in France, so that's a long time ago. And basically, it's called the Decree of Arles. It's a city that still exists today. And basically, the bishop puts out a decree against the Jews. This is in the year 425. He puts out a decree against the Jews, saying the Jews cannot own Christian slaves, cannot be soldiers in the army, and interestingly, cannot be lawyers. So there was law was important there, and so he bans Jews from those fields. And later on, there's not many years later, there's someone named Saint Hilary of Arles, which is someone who's known to this day. And actually, I didn't know that Hilary was a man's name. But Saint Hilary of Arles, he treats the Jews much better, and overall starts improving the treatment. I will say, though, that in general, the treatment of Jews in France is one of the more difficult ones. We're going to see later really the Jews had a tough run in many countries, but definitely in the Dark Ages, France was one of the worst places to be. In the year 508, the Franks take over for the Visigoths, and the Visigoths were somewhat good to the Jews, and so that ends the honeymoon for the Jews. And in the 8th and 9th century, we're moving along quickly because I really want to focus more on more modern history. In the 8th to 9th century, you have the Carolingian dynasty, and they're nice to Jews. They let Jews own land and partake in all kinds of professions, and Jews really have a great amount of freedom and really are having a good life. It's very important to note that even though I say France, and France has its own distinct Jewish history, France and Germany are often in Jewish literature and communal life and minhag, etc., are both lumped together in a country called Ashkenaz. So because of the proximity, and you see in areas like Alsace-Lorraine, where there are areas that are sometimes Germany, sometimes France, even as recent as 100 years ago. So it's important to note that there's this proximity of the Ashkenaz communities, France and Western Germany. Anyhow, so the Jews have a good life, and they can engage in any profession they want. They have a good time, and again, they go under the umbrella of Ashkenaz. However, very big difference between Ashkenaz of France and Ashkenaz of Germany, and that is that Ashkenaz of France have other neighbors. Who else are the neighbors of Ashkenaz of France? They're neighbors of the Spanish Jews. And so French Jews receive a huge amount of influence from the Jews of Spain. That's why you see Rashi, who we're going to talk about in a moment, and others very greatly influenced by the scholarship and modernity of Spanish Jewry. So French Jews, unlike Ashkenaz Jews, are much more influenced by the Western thinking, meaning the thinking of the Jews of Spain. So that's just something to note, that life is good, but they're also influenced by the Jews of Spain. In the 11th century, you see this huge spike in creativity, a huge spike of creativity, and the Jews of France really become some of the most famous ones in terms of their Torah scholarship. I'm going to start with a very, very important one, because he is seen as the link between two, I don't even want to say generations, it's eras, and that is Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGolah. Basically, does anyone know what the name of the people who wrote the Mishnah is? There's like a few parts in our history, stages. You have the stage of the Mishnah, who are the Tanaim. That's the name of those rabbis. You have the stage of the Talmud, the Amoraim. And then we're already shifting to Babylon, Iraq. You have later the Savoraim, short period, Geonim, which is the great rabbis of Babylon. And the next one is Rishonim. That's already the medieval European scholars, mostly. The transition happens with a person born in France named Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGolah. Now, to be known as the rabbi who enlightens the entire exile, the entire diaspora, means you must be very significant, and that is exactly what he does. Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGolah, by the way, is most famous for instituting several decrees which will be applied across the entire Ashkenazi Jewish world, and even in some of the Sephardic world. The rules that he makes are very famous, and one is he bans polygamy. Until that time, it was acceptable, and according to the Torah law, the Mishnah law, and definitely because Jews came from the Middle East where this was more acceptable, polygamy was acceptable. Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGolah, born in France, is a rising star, and he says, folks, as a community, this is not happening anymore. There's a lot of discussions. There's actually a lot of folklore with crazy stories about him having 2 wives and the fights that they had, but it's not very strongly evidenced or based. But basically, he makes a rule and says, guys, no more polygamy. Interestingly, because he was in Ashkenaz, a lot of these rules didn't even get heard in places like Yemen, where actually in Israeli law, Jews from Yemen were allowed to have more than 1 wife because they were not part of this new world order. So Rabbeinu Gershom makes some rules, if you want to say, to make the Jews more European or more adjusted with the times. The other rule that he makes, which all the rules are pretty progressive. The other rule that he makes is a cherem on anyone who reads the mail of someone else. Again, you can let your wild imagination go out there and wonder why it is that this was a thing that he banned, but he made a ban on reading the mail of someone else. Technically speaking, that's not something that's forbidden by the Torah, and so going in and reading someone else's letter is something that's forbidden by Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGolah. There's a very famous story, a funny story, about a yeshiva, a place of Torah study, that used to read all the mail of the students that would come in. Married students, single students, they would check, sort of like the Soviet censorship. They would check everyone's letters. So they came over to one of the married men there, and they say, congratulations, your wife, who lives 2 towns over, just had a baby. He says, how do you know? He says, well, we read it in the letter she sent you. He says, wait a minute. Is it my first wife or my second wife? They say, what do you mean? You have 2 wives? That's forbidden. He says, really? It's forbidden? Well, Rabbeinu Gershom, who forbade having 2 wives, also said you can't read other people's mail. So he sort of gave it to them. But yeah, those are 2 rules that Rabbeinu Gershom made. And another rule that he made that actually has a very big impact to this day is that a woman cannot be divorced against her will. It used to be that according to strict law, a person can give his wife a get, and that's it. And he banned that and sort of put in a more civil interaction where it had to be by consent of both parties. Next person is really probably the greatest. I'm actually not here to decide in the competition between Rabbeinu Gershom and Rashi, but Rashi, it's fair to say, is the greatest French Jewish rabbi, and he lived between 1040 and 1105, and he really transformed our life. Because if you take a look at any of the books in the back, the Chumashim, you will find Rashi's commentary. So who was Rashi, and what kind of life did he have? So he was born and died in a small town in France called Troyes, and he grows up in France. And when he's 20 and he gets married, as was customary, he goes to study in yeshiva in Mainz, which is in Germany. Why? Because there are no major yeshivas and centers of Torah inside France yet. Believe it or not, the big Torah studies study halls are in Germany, in Mainz and Worms and Speyer, the big Jewish old communities. Now he goes to study there for 10 years. He's there, and then he comes back to France. By the time he comes back to France, he's already a great scholar. People know about him, and he starts working in business. And he does something that is not common. That is, all of his Torah leadership is for free. He refuses to take any money for any communal role, and at the same time, he adjudicates cases. He teaches, and he, most importantly, he writes. He writes responsa in the way that Babylonian Jewry became famous. Any question that someone had, he would send out, and he starts establishing a yeshiva. Very important for the longevity of a Jewish community to have a yeshiva, a place of Torah study, and that is what Rashi does. By the way, Rashi is short for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. Everyone thinks this was always his name. It was not. He was always known as Rabbi Shlomo, and more relevant to us, he was also known as Rabbi Shlomo HaTzarfati, Rabbi Shlomo the French. Why? Because he was the one who really established French Jewry as a center for Torah study. So he is the French Rabbi Shlomo, and he starts writing commentary that really takes over the Jewish world. He writes a commentary on the Chumash, based mostly on Talmudic sources, and it's very popular. It's simple, it's to the point, and he writes in a way that is so vast that is unparalleled. He writes on the 5 books of Moses, he writes on most of the Tanakh, and also almost the entirety of the Talmud. He has very short, to the point, simple commentary. I feel I would feel remiss not to say the joke, the famous joke they say, where so he writes about the Chumash, the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, and Tanakh. So they say that his wife walks out one day, and she's wearing a his wife is wearing a purple dress, and he says, "I notice you're wearing the purple dress. Why is that?" And she looks at him and says, "Must you comment on everything?" And that is because, of course, his commentary is really something that is, he does. He comments on everything. You have him on, the prophets, etc. So Rashi establishes a yeshiva, attracts many. And unfortunately, during the time of Rashi, even though he brings a great deal of Torah knowledge to France, this is when life in France becomes really, really terrible for Jews. This is when you start having the Crusades, and this is when Jewish communities are ravaged. I think with the help of everyone here, and having studied so many Jewish communities, I think there's a formula to the comfort Jews will have in a country. And you can apply that to America as you wish. The formula for a good Jewish life in a country, now a good Jewish life in a country doesn't mean necessarily it's going to be the most, it's not going to be like Poland, which wasn't necessarily great, but it was good Jewish life, I mean safe. A safe Jewish life is as long as the population is more philo-Semitic than the government, you're okay. So for example, in Italy, if they put on a rule against Jews, the population doesn't really keep it because they like Jews and they're nice. As opposed to places like France, where if there was a rule against Jews, the population really went with it and stuck it to the Jews. And the irony is that some of the Crusades begin in Italy. They're initiated by the Pope, but in Italy, the Jews are fine. It's in France and those places where the people really, the masses get enraged and violent towards the Jews. That's the irony. So you have to distinguish and look in 2 levels. What does the government do about Jews? But also, how do the masses react to that? And unfortunately, in France, the masses react very strongly. I hate to say this, by the way, but I heard this once from someone Jewish speaking about the Holocaust. And he said the most surprising thing about the Holocaust was that it came from Germany and not from France, because historically speaking, in France, the masses were very, very hostile to Jews very often. And we'll see that later in terms of the Dreyfus Affair, etc. But in the time of Rashi, you start seeing these crusades, you start seeing these attacks on Jews that are really very, very difficult, and that happens through the time of Rashi. Rashi's uniqueness is that despite him being a huge Torah scholar, he is not necessarily aiming for the greatest Torah scholar. He is aiming for the common Jewish people. So he's writing these very simple explanations for the Talmud, very simple explanations for Chumash. And he also is great at bringing people together, creating very peaceful communities. And in that sense, he is a really great asset to the Jewish people. We don't know a huge amount about Rashi's personal life, but because he was such a huge figure in Jewish history, there are many, many tales about Rashi. I don't know if anyone here heard the various, anyone ever hear the tales about Rashi? Well, there's one story that his mother was pregnant and someone came with a chariot trying to run her over, and she stepped back and there became a sort of a dent in the wall as a miracle to save her, and they'll point to that dent. There's all kinds of stories about him, but it's important to note that we don't know that we know a huge amount about his commentary, etc. But a lot of these stories just came about because he was he still is such a popular figure. Another interesting thing is if you look in the Chumash, in any book, they call it the Rashi font for his commentary, and the font didn't exist until 1475, hundreds of years after he died. It's just a font that people associate with him. Anyhow, he has a few daughters, and they all marry very prominent rabbis who will become the leaders of French Jewry. One of them is Rabbeinu Tam, another is Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, and Rivam. And they are also very close with him. They live there. They establish centers of Torah study. It's ironic because, well, I guess in a way it's beautiful and very Jewish that a lot of Rashi's sons-in-law and grandchildren are always disputing him. It's like a Jewish Friday night or Passover dinner. Right? So he writes commentary taking one position, and they say, no, actually, the right explanation is the other way. You'll see sometimes people have two pairs of tefillin, one according to Rashi, one according to Rabbeinu Tam, and it's like you wonder what was going on in the house, which pair of tefillin did they have? But it's very Jewish that everyone has the right to disagree. Other great rabbis, Rabbi Moshe of Kutzi wrote the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol. And that leads us into the 1200s, where you again have repeated crusades and more attacks on the Jews, very violent attacks. The most famous of the attacks on Jews, which is unique to France in many ways, is the 1242 or 1244, depends who you ask, burning of the Talmud, the famous burning of the Talmud in Paris. What happened? Interestingly, one of the great rabbis then in the generation, his name was Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. He's a great Torah scholar, and his works can be found here in the bookshelf in the Balei HaTosafot. He has a student, and this student, who later became known as Nicholas Donnan, becomes a Karaite, meaning he denies the oral Torah, the rabbinic traditions, and he only believes in the written Torah. And now you have something that's a bit of a difference between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. This student gets excommunicated. Ashkenazi Jews in general are stronger with the excommunication. And in Sephardic communities, people learn to get along despite differences more often. But in the Ashkenazi communities, these differences are sharper. And so he excommunicates his student. The student remains excommunicated for 10 years. After 10 years, he can't, this was not the Upper West Side where you can be excommunicated from one community, you just go to the other shul, you go to the other pizza shop. It didn't work this way. You really had to fall into a place in medieval Europe. And so the student, Nicholas Donnan, converts to Catholicism after 10 years. And now he starts his mission of revenge. And his mission of revenge against his rabbi, imagine, there's got to be a movie about this, because just think about the interpersonal dynamics, right? He's excommunicated by his rabbi. He is for 10 years in limbo. And then he says, you know what? I'm just going to convert to Christianity. He goes to Rome. He lobbies the Pope. And he says, look, the Talmud is a book that you must ban. Why? Two main reasons. One, it defames Christianity. It defames the founders of Christianity. And that's one reason. And the second reason is it has very different laws for Jews and non-Jews. It says you have this law for Jews and this law for non-Jews. Now, this is a very powerful point in medieval Europe, because the Jews are the money lenders, and a Jew cannot lend money with interest to another Jew, but he could lend to someone who isn't Jewish. Never mind that the same rule applies to Christians and Muslims, meaning they also have this standard where you can't lend with interest to members of your faith. But anyhow, he puts out this claim. It's interesting. A lot of these claims today are brought up also by anti-Semites. It's the same. It's like 1,000 years don't pass. They bring up the same stuff. Anyhow, the Pope sends a letter to the King of France, and they decide they're going to have a trial. First, the King sends out people all over the homes and says, collect all the copies of the Talmud in France to Paris. Bring them all to Paris. Now, it's important to understand, every time you had a manuscript back then, it is handwritten. One book could be a year's work. And so you can't just go back online and order another copy from Eichler's. This is centuries of work. And many Jewish communities didn't even have, many countries did not have a full copy of the Talmud. There were many countries, Jewish communities, there was not a full copy of the Talmud. And here he goes, he collects copies of the Talmud from all over France, and he brings them to Paris. He puts the Talmud on trial, but unlike the trial that happened later in Spain, he says during this trial, you may not defame Christianity or suggest that it's invalid. So it's sort of like being on a, what do they call that? When you have a arm wrestle and your hand is tied. Yeah. So basically, the rabbis have to defend themselves, but they can't say X, Y, and Z. And the rabbis that are chosen are Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, whose student is the head Christian trying to get the Talmud destroyed, and Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, and also Rabbi Moshe of Kusi. So they have this trial. The queen oversees it as a judge, and shockingly, the Talmud is found guilty. They burn it, and they burn it, actually, interestingly, they burn it outside of the Notre Dame church, which still exists in Paris. They burn it, and this shocks French Jewry in a way that is so profound that to this day, Ashkenaz Jewry, to this day, we say a lamentation on Tisha B'Av for this event, and I'll explain why. So it's a very traumatizing event because basically there's no more books. There's no more books. You have the Chumash, and that's it. And for Jewish life, we've seen not having a copy of the Talmud, not having a copy of the law is a death blow to a Jewish community. And so they burn the Talmud. It says 24, some versions say 40 carts of Talmud in the heart of Paris. And there's a famous lamentation, Shalis Rufa Ba'esh, that's written about it by Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg. Many of the students of the Rabbi Yechiel of Paris and the Maharam of Rottenburg then decided they're going to try and move to Israel, because what are you going to do without books? And so Jews continue to live in France, but it's a much tougher life. Later on, there's a crusade in 1248 led by King Louis. Then you have an expulsion after an expulsion after an expulsion, until finally in 1306, all Jews are expelled from France. Of course, there are still some who remain, but all Jews are expelled from France. In 1306, King Philip expels them, and 100,000 Jews overnight flee. We know a lot about the Spanish expulsion, but think about it. 100,000 Jews had to just pack up and go. And so it was less dramatic in the sense that, you didn't have the same inquisition that you had in Spain, but Jews had to pack out. And it's interesting because also there was an area that did not have to leave, and that is the area of Provence. The area of Provence in France was more independent, and it had many, many great Torah scholars. It was called Chachmei Provence, and they were not expelled until about 200 years later in 1500. But basically, the rest of France, Jews are kicked out. I'm going to fast forward a bit. 1685, there's an amnesty. The king announces that Jews are allowed to come and travel and have a freedom of movement. And 1776, the same year as the establishment of the United States, the king announces that Jews are free to move throughout France. Just to give you a perspective, in the year where this starts being debated, there are about 35,000 Ashkenazi Jews in Alsace-Lorraine, close to Germany, and 5,000 Jews who are Sephardic in South Spain. Now, here comes the big debate. The French, who just had about 400 years of crusades and expulsions of Jews, now debate returning Jews to the civil area, especially as the Renaissance comes, and there's this belief of giving people equality. There's a whole debate, and I want to read to you a speech that was given in the House of the People by a very famous fellow, Stanislas Adelred. And you'll recognize, even if you've never put the name together, you'll recognize the words. But they say to me, these are words that are said in 1789, as they're debating whether to give Jews equal rights. But they say to me, the Jews have their own judges and laws. I respond to that, it is your fault, and you should not allow that. We must refuse everything to the Jews as a nation and accord everything to the Jews as individuals. Very famous word. We must deny Jews as a nation everything, and we must give the Jews as individuals everything. Meaning, there should no longer be a situation where the Jews have courts that are recognized and their own institutions that are recognized. Rather, the Jews should be dealt with individually. Think about it this way. In the Middle Ages, modernity did to people what Amazon did to the stores. What do I mean? Meaning, in the Middle Ages, the king didn't care about one person or the other. He needed his taxes. So he says, I treat you as a city, as a church, as a synagogue. Give me the amount of money that I need, and I don't care what's going on inside. And that worked out for many Jewish communities, meaning we got together, we had our own autonomy, our own synagogue, our own courts, our own legal system, our own even punishments. And basically, we can do whatever we want as long as we pay taxes. Comes modernity and says, no, we're not dealing anymore with communities. The government will deal with individuals one at a time, which means no more need for the organizing community. Believe it or not, there were many Jews who were against that. And there was even a split between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. The Ashkenazi, more German Jews of Alsace-Lorraine said, we don't want full rights. We don't want to abolish our courts. We don't want to abolish our independence and autonomy. And the Sephardic Jews in southern France are saying, what do you mean? We want to be modern citizens. We want to go to the French court. We want to be able to have our own lives. And for a few years, the Ashkenazi Jews had their way. And the law in France even distinguished between different kinds of Jews. So if you're a Sephardic Jew who wants to be fully modernized and deal with the state, you got full rights. If you're a Jew in Alsace-Lorraine who wants to live in the shtetl, in the ghetto, no problem, but you have no rights. You have to be dealt with as a community. And this carries on until the French Revolution, which promises equality to all. Now, here's where you have a real problem, and that is, what do you do about the Jews? Do you give them free rights? And does that mean that they don't have any religious rights? Because many of their religious rights came from having your own courts and your own system. So the person who was most fascinated by this question was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was obsessed with the Jews, very, very obsessed with the Jews. And he first portrays himself as a liberator of the Jews. When he conquers Italy and other places, the first thing that he does is he breaks down the walls of the ghetto. He brings other Jews with him. I don't know if there were photo ops back then, probably not, but he brings Jews with him and it looks great, and they smash the walls of the ghetto, and he is the redeemer. He actually had a bit of a messiah complex. He's the redeemer of the Jews. He got until in his military quest, he got all the way to Israel, and he actually wanted to establish a Jewish state in Israel and rebuild the third temple. Yeah, he put out a declaration to the Jews. He had an obsession with the Jews, and in many ways it was good in the sense that he wanted equality. But yeah, he did believe he would liberate Jerusalem and rebuild the third temple. Anyhow. So, but he wants to know what the Jews, what their side of the story is. Do you guys plan on being equal citizens or not? And for this, he gathers, shows you sort of his messianic obsession. He gathers what he called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the high court we only had around the time of the Second Temple, also a bit after. And he gathers 71 rabbis from across France, also a few from Germany. And he says, I want you to deal with this situation, with these questions. And he gives them 7 questions. And basically it's a trade-off. It's, do you guys want to be equal members of society? And if yes, what are you going to do about it? So he asks them, are you guys going to allow polygamy? Which I don't know why he asked them, because Rabbeinu Gershom forbid it. What does halacha say? Here's a very important question about intermarriage. if you want to be equal citizens and your sister goes off and marries a Frenchman, are you going to be okay with it? And if not, can you really call yourself a French citizen? Meaning, and this is very, very necessary to understand what's going on in France today, whether it's talking about Stars of David or kippas or burqas, basically and this is very different than America, for the French to recognize you as a human being, you need to forsake your religion, which is very un-American. Basically, there's a condition. Do you want to be in a society that treats you equally? Fine. But you got to drop anything that marks you as unique. If you want to be part of it, sounds crazy if you're American, right? It's like, if you want to be a true Frenchman, then you must shed any symbol that is not neutral. And if you want to be sort of your own groupie, then can you really ask to be treated equally? That's the French logic. It sounds crazy if you're American because, our thought is, what do you mean? Everyone should be treated equally, but, regardless of who they are. But the French Revolution thinking is, and obviously it's grounded in all the fighting between religious groups in the Dark Ages, but basically the French thinking is if you want to be treated equally, you have to shed any symbol that makes you different. So he asks them, well, the French don't like the Jews because, this is more than 1,000 years. The fact that there's anti-Semitism in France is not because, it's something that's been there for many hundreds of years, but there is, regardless of the anti-Semitism that you'll find in French society, not all, of course, there is this attitude towards religion. If you want to be religious, you can't do it publicly. Okay, so that's why they'll be against people wearing a cross, or now it's a big issue with Muslim immigrants where they say if you want to go to public school, you cannot wear a burqa, a headscarf, because the idea is that the equality of the public sphere must mean that we are all shedding any symbol of any affiliation. So that's the idea. But he asks these rabbis, what do you think the rabbis should say? What should the rabbis say when he asks them all these questions? Are you against intermarriage? Are you against who should elect rabbis? Are you allowed to lend money with interest to non-Jews? And then if you're treating Jews and non-Jews differently, you're lending money with interest to a non-Jew and with no interest to a Jew, how can you ask to be treated equally? These are the kinds of questions that he asks the Sanhedrin. And in retrospect, it's easy to judge them. They give a very, very, how should I say, very tame response, in the sense that they say, of course, basically, we'll go, and these were very, very Orthodox rabbis. They say, of course, we won't condemn people for doing this or that, and we'll treat everyone equally, and we believe Jews should be soldiers in the French army. They go on with, and even in terms of the laws of interest, they go on beyond. It's easy to understand why they did it. If you've lived for centuries under expulsions, pogroms, and persecutions, you'll say that, of course, I'm shedding a lot of my unique religious aspects, which is what happened. Sadly, right after they gave him this whole beautiful answer, by the way, the participants of this Sanhedrin meeting each got a medal. They sell them in auction houses today, where Napoleon is giving the Torah. You see Napoleon holding the tablets, and he's giving it to a Jewish rabbi who's like sitting ready to receive it. You can see a bit of his messianic complex in it. But basically, he sees himself as the liberator. But nonetheless, right after this, he makes something called le décret infâme, which means the infamous decree, which is he makes a law that actually takes away some of the rights that Jews have at the time. He orders that every Jewish community with more than 2,000 Jews should have a consortium, and that sort of organizes their civil affairs, not a rabbi, not a Beit Din, but some sort of civil organization, and that there should be a central organization for Jews in Europe. I'm quickly going to go now to the next topic, which is the Dreyfus Affair. 1894, famously, you have the Dreyfus Affair splits Europe, and that is because this Jewish soldier in France's intelligence unit is basically blamed for no good reason with very shabby evidence, which later is, they find out a lot of it is forged. And France is divided. Famously, when they give the decree, all the people in the stadium scream, death to the Jews. They don't say death to Dreyfus, they say death to the Jews. And it gives many Jews in France an idea that maybe, even though we've been emancipated, perhaps the French still hate us. And there was famously a journalist there in the audience named Theodor Herzl, who, by the way, this is not necessarily historically true. At the time, supposedly, when he sees what's going on, says that Europe will never accept us. The only solution there can be here is if we have a Jewish state that will solve the problem of anti-Semitism. It didn't, but it did do a lot of other good things. But this really divides France, and it shows the Jews that maybe emancipation is not the solution to all. In the year 1900, I didn't say this at the beginning, but this is very important. French Jewry is the third largest Jewish community. It's a very large Jewish community, bigger than Britain, Canada, etc. So in 1900, there are 90,000 Jews in France. By 1935, there are 260,000 Jews in France. And on the eve of the Holocaust, there are 400 Jews in France, meaning Jews are immigrating to France. As much as it's easy to dunk on the French anti-Semitism, Jews are moving there. And in post-Holocaust years, it's the only country where Jews migrate to in Europe. So right after the Holocaust, France is the only place where Jews are going to. Obviously, during the Holocaust, Germany invades France. There's the Vichy government in the south of France. But basically, French Jews are taken to deportation camps, which take them eventually to concentration camps. And about a quarter of French Jewry, 78,000 Jews are killed in the Holocaust, which, if you think about it, is a very, very low ratio in comparison to Polish Jewry, where it's about 80–90%, Lithuanian Jewry, 94%. In France, it's about 25%. So, and the French police helps the Germans, and they do terrible things, but it's not nearly as high a percentage as the Eastern European countries. Just something to think about. After the Holocaust, like I said, many Jews go to France as a way it's the only place in Europe that Jews will go to. And here's where, interestingly, the Jewish population in France explodes. And so Jews from North Africa start fleeing to France once the Arab countries expel their Jews. Thousands of Jews from Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, hundreds of thousands of Jews go to France, so that most Jews in France today are actually from these North African Jewish communities. I just want to give you a final number and end off with this. Very important. On the eve of the Holocaust, there are 300,000 Jews in France. After the Holocaust, 180,000. By 1951, 250,000 Jews. By the 1970s, 530,000, more than 500,000. And in 2002, 520,000. 2013, 478,000. What happened? How did the number go down so sharply between 2002 and 2013? Maybe someone wants to answer. And there's a question here I'm going to answer in a moment. What happened? Why did the number of Jews decline so sharply between 2002 and 2013? Yeah. So there is a lot of PLO, Palestinian anti-Semitism, already in the 1960s. But what happens is, when you have the second Intifada break out in Israel, And this whole narrative of the Jews are killing Palestinian children, the medieval narrative, a blood libel, right, that says the Jews are killing Palestinian children, that's when you have violent attacks on Jews all over France, and mostly, this Palestinian nationalist type of violence, and tens of thousands of Jews leave France to Israel, New York, the U.S., Canada, etc. That slows down at some point. The Jews today in France sort of learned how to work with what's going on in terms of security for synagogues, etc. But that was a very, very big hit to French Jewish community. But it's important to note the French Jewish community in a way is very quiet. We don't hear about them in the news so much. It is the third largest Jewish community. They're very, very big. So it's just something important to know. One question that came here: why did the Jews go to France after the Holocaust? So French anti-Semitism was always more subtle, and it is officially an open society. It is officially the mother of Jewish emancipation. It's the first country that gave Jews full emancipation in a way. Well, America is, but it started the process. And so it was a free society. And unlike Poland, where you went back and got pogromed, unlike Germany, who perpetrated the Holocaust, unlike Eastern Europe, which was under communist rule, unlike Spain, who expelled the Jews and the Jews never really came back there, France was a very, very good option for people. Again, their police helped round up the Jews, but it wasn't openly anti-Semitic. Yeah.
What is the reason that fewer Jews or a lower percentage of the population of Jews in France were murdered during the Holocaust? I know some of France was not occupied.
Mm-hmm. You don't see in France the same kind of ghettos that there were ghettos and the Jews were rounded up, but you don't see the same kind of cruelty. Also partially because between 1940 and 1942, southern France was called the Vichy Government, and it was supposed to be somewhat independent. So Jews were discriminated against very strongly, but it was officially not under Nazi control. And so it just didn't have the same level of violence that the Eastern European countries have. You don't see the scenes of, the pits of people being shot into mass graves that you see in Ukraine, Belarus, the camps that you have in Poland, you don't have in France. So yes, the French Jews are rounded up in camps like Drezny and others and sent to Auschwitz and Treblinka, but you just don't see the same kind of violence. And I'll show you another place where you see that the French are not as bad as others in some ways. The French resistance was very open to Jews. If you wanted to be a partisan and fight the Germans, it was more open to Jews. If you were in Poland, the Polish resistance would kill you in the forests. So if you came to the Polish resistance and said, let's fight the Nazis together, they kill you. As opposed to the French. Look, again, the French are very anti-Semitic in some ways, but they're not nearly as anti-Semitic in other ways. So it is officially a liberal democracy, etc.
In France anymore with all the Muslims there.
Look, you know what? I think a lot of people called the end of France and England and other Jewish communities in the early 2000s, and I think thank God those visions of saying that the Jewish community is going to end, etc., didn't end up happening. Just a question. Or a comment here, if you online, is the Jews who immigrate at the end of the 20th century were the first to be deported. It's true. They first sent out the Jews who the campaign in Nazi-occupied France was first against those who were not French citizens, Polish, etc., refugees. Those were the first one to be sent to camps. And then another one, I see there's a lot of comments here. There's a movie called The Train about art movement during the war. There's a lot of that. Curious George, anyone know the book, kids book, Curious George? That was written by French Jews or it's sort of symbolic of what they went through. Yeah, that is it. For now, we got to stop here. I'd like to thank everyone. Be'ezrat Hashem, very similar because a lot of them came to France, but it has much more history. Be'ezrat Hashem, next week, we'll be speaking about the Jews of Morocco, who obviously had a very strong connection. I didn't get to speak this week about Kol Israel Chaverim, the Alliance des Israelites. So Be'ezrat Hashem, next week, we'll be speaking about Moroccan Jewry. I'd like to thank everyone for participating online and here. And Be'ezrat Hashem, next week, Morocco.